Thanks for having
Hey
us.
Neil, how you doing? Let me
Doing
see. Am I
good.
muted?
No, we hear you.
Oh, cool. Yes, thank you everyone for being here. I think Hugh's going to go first, but yeah, we'll run through a wide scope of the evidence that giants exist and there's associated with the lost world, pre-existing advanced civilization, and I'm really glad to be able to talk about these subjects.
All right. Okay. So let's just make sure you can see this. Okay. Let me just check. Yeah, that's the one. Okay. So I guess you can see that the screen up there. Ancient Nephilim, pyramids, and stone circles. And yeah, so this is something that I've been interested in for a very long time. I've been working with Jim over the years, and actually Jim is actually on this version of the image here. And we've written a book called Giants on Record, and we're working on a new book about the British giants and megalithic sites and the connections between them. But really, it is a worldwide phenomena. One of the things we do as well as Megalithomania, which is a company that I run, we do tours to many of these places. And me and Jim are actually doing one in Egypt, because we've been doing, as you'll see in this lecture, I'm going to briefly mention some of the giant accounts we've actually got from there, which is like completely blown my mind. I've written a 2-part article for the Ancient Origins website, and while we travel around the world doing these tours and expeditions, I do private trips on my own with Jim and JJ and others. We do investigate while we do these, so I hope maybe you can join us on some of these. This is a recent book I've worked on, Megalith Studies in Stone, that was released last year, and some other stuff, including the book I did with Jim. We also did a show called Search for the Lost Giants back in 2014-15, and the book is kind of a summary of some of that. And really, my main focus of research is the megalithic sites. So this is an image of Stonehenge I took with my jetpack recently. I fly around the landscape. People have sightings all the time. But this just shows you, this is just one of the many sites around the world that people don't realize have giant associations. It's quite well known, Stonehenge. Obviously, it's the most visited tourist site in Britain, one of the most visited sites in the world. It's got astronomical alignments, sophisticated geometry. Its placement in the landscape is very relevant to surveying and astronomy as well. It has complicated measurement systems. And as you can see on the top right there, it also has these kind of evidence of stone softening and shaping, which is one of the traits of these megalithic builders, which I believe were partly giants. That was part of their skill set that we find all over the world. Obviously, Stonehenge was built in multiple different stages. I'm not going to go into detail about this right now, but it's a very technical, very sophisticated site. But one of the legends to do with Stonehenge goes back to the 1100s, and it's obviously much earlier than that, written by Geoffrey of Monmouth in the History of the Kings of Britain, this famous chronicle that came out from this Welsh monk. And one of the stories, not only all the Arthurian stories are in there, but one of the stories is that the stones originally came from North Africa and were transported to Ireland, to a place called Kilarus, and eventually they were, thousands of years later, they were transported over by Merlin using magical means to Salisbury Plain, where the stones are found today. And so this is the earliest depiction of Stonehenge on the right there. That was in a French version of the History of the Kings of Britain. It clearly shows what looks like a 14-foot giant moving one of the lintels into place, with Merlin assisting him. On the left there, we have a very interesting trilithon, not from Salisbury Plain, but from Libya in North Africa. And so these stories about the stones coming from this part of the world have some reality to them. There are actual sites that you can't go to now. Many of them have been destroyed around Tripoli area of Libya. that have these trilithons and have these associations with giants. We have that at Masura in Morocco. This is actually from Tunisia, this particular shot here, right on the western edge of Tunisia, going into almost Libya. And this shows you the masonry style. And so it does suggest, you know, it's just putting it out there that these legends, these stories that go back to the 1100s actually have some reality to them, and actually talk about these stones being transported from this part of the world. We have a classic stone circle here, for instance, also in Libya. One of the most interesting aspects of Stonehenge, which people don't realize, is that it's actually began being constructed 10,000 years ago. Now, this has been carbon dated. This has been proven scientifically. This is a reality. Any of you have been to Stonehenge in the last few years, you're not going to see this image. You're not going to see these 3 painted blobs of white paint on a car park anymore, because they've grassed this over and they built a different visitor center further away. But these Mesolithic post holes would have contained 3 massive pine poles, potentially up to 30 to 40 feet tall. And they marked the location of Stonehenge 10,000 years ago, about 4,500, 5,000 years before the main circle began to be built. Interestingly, this is the time when Gobekli Tepe in southeast Turkey was being closed down, and there's now new evidence in the DNA research which puts it at the DNA is linked from this part of Turkey as it is to ancient Britain. We have various different things happening around the Stonehenge landscape, which blows my mind. We have all this different geometry, this astronomical clues, as you can see here. We have a very sophisticated way of squaring the circle, which was developed by Michael Schneider and John Michel. And really, the whole megalithic world in Britain is highly sophisticated. And this quote from Alexander Thom, who was a Scottish engineer who worked for Oxford University, who surveyed hundreds of stone circles in Britain, concluded, and I'll read this to you, only in a period when megalithic man was setting out the sophisticated stone rings has a sufficiently high standard of mathematical knowledge and skill ever been reached before the 15th century AD. Even today, there are few archaeologists capable of appreciating the underlying geometry. Now, you might be asking why I'm doing all this stuff on megalithic sites and geometry, astronomy, and so forth. Well, actually, it's because the traits of the Nephilim, if we go back, and we're going to look at this a bit later, and we're going to get into it with Jim as well, they were master astronomers, they were master geometers, they worked with metal, they worked with worshipping the sky, i.e. measuring the sky. They were also surveyors and stone builders. And so all these things that we find at Stonehenge are linked with this biblical giant narrative that goes back thousands and thousands of years. But what's really intriguing is that some of the remains of these giants have actually been found within the Stonehenge landscape. No one is talking about this. So we're going to be talking about this, and we're going to be putting this actually in our next book and looking at the British giants, because to me, you know, this is where I'm based. I'm based within the Stonehenge landscape itself. And interestingly, the first ever name of Stonehenge, before Stonehenge, which is the Saxon name meaning hanging stones, actually used to be called the Giant Dance. And so this is actually has a giant connection, and the oldest name remembered is that. This is one of the examples we're going to feature in the book. So this is a 14 feet, 10-inch giant, almost 15 feet tall, that was recorded a very long time ago, but reported in 1802. There are various different variations on this. We go into these in the book. One variation is 13 foot 10, 14 foot 10, and 12 foot, according to 3 different witnesses at the time. But basically, whoever it was, they were really, really tall. And they were found in one of the mounds in this area. We also have this one. This is from the early 1700s, published in 1830 again, and it describes a 9 foot 4-inch skeleton being found within a mound within the Stonehenge landscape towards Salisbury. We know where the mound is. We know where the churchyard, St Edmund's Churchyard, is now. And there were follow-ups to this, and other witnesses talking about this. And so immediately we have 2 remarkable skeletons. And these are just 2 of several, which we're not going to go into now. We're going to put all those in the book, that we found in this particular part of the Stonehenge landscape. But strangely, there's actually a tradition that goes back at least 600 years In Salisbury, which is the closest, pretty much the closest city to Stonehenge, only a few miles away, of the parading this great Salisbury giant, this 18-foot giant around town, over and over again, every summer solstice, or June the 24th was the date they did it. Sometimes they did it on St. George's Day, which is what's happened. They still do it now, even though the giant doesn't get paraded around. It stopped a few years ago because it's moth infested, but you can still actually see it in the museum. But the strange thing is, why have they got this 600 or 700-year-old tradition of giants and parading him around every summer solstice, which is what Stonehenge is aligned to? Going back that far, I mean, what is that all about? Why is this tradition still strong? He later became known a few hundred years ago as Saint Christopher. It became more of a biblical saint. And I kind of thought, well, why would they call this giant, this known 18-foot parading giant, Saint Christopher? And actually, he is a Canaanite giant, also known as Reprobus, who's said to come over from the Bible lands, and he was said to be either 12 feet or 12 cubits tall. And this is recorded in all the biblical narrative. 12 cubits is actually around 18 feet. But all the depictions of him have him as a giant. And so why is there this ancient giant connection with Stonehenge if there's not some reality to these mysteries? So Stonehenge itself, we know, if you look at the blue rectangle in there, if you divide that in half, it becomes what's known as the lunation triangle. And this is specifically aligned, if you look at this image in front of us, to the southerly moonrise, northerly moonrise, and sun and moon sets, the winter solstice sunset, and so on, summer solstice sunrise. They're all aligned to this particular rectangle. And these 4 station stones that mark it are significant, because if you expand this exactly 2,500 times across the landscape, we have this, and this is discovered by Robin Heath. That's his website there if you want to check it out, robinheath.info. He's a remarkable guy. He's written some amazing books, and I do recommend you check out his work. See, the bluestone site where many of the stones came from is connected with this great geodetic triangle, the 5-12-13 triangle, which is linked with Lundy Island, which we're going to get onto in a moment. It also passes through Glastonbury. So this is, again, one of the traits of the giants from the Bible lands. They were master surveyors. And so these qualities keep turning up. And there's even evidence, fairly good evidence, that in the stories, if you go back to the Book of Enoch and the Book of Giants, it talks about these watchers or Anunnaki actually coming over and flying around to different parts of the world, including possibly Britain, looking through these windows, which could be the windows of, like the in between the stones of Stonehenge, and making these astronomical observations which match the latitude and longitude of the area around Stonehenge. And so we're going to get into that in the book in much more detail, but we think there's a connection, and actually there could be some reality to these ancient biblical stories of these giants and watchers and Anunnaki traveling around the world. Stonehenge and Wales, where the bluestone site is located, is actually connected with this. In Glastonbury, we have an 12th century rather, mid 1100s, 1190 rather, where a massive giant was discovered buried in Glastonbury Abbey. This is not known information. People aren't talking about this. And it was so large, it was described as you could place your fist between the eye sockets, and they were as wide as the palm of a man's hand. So this was a really remarkable discovery, buried 16 feet below the ground in this Celtic style log coffin. They also found this lead cross a bit further up in the ground, which described, I think that's a fake, it's a lead cross. It describes this as the burial place of King Arthur, because the Arthurian mythos was very strong at this time, especially because of the history of the kings of Britain, where that whole story emerged from or was recorded in. So we've got, potentially 9 or 10 foot tall giants found in Glastonbury, but no one's talking about it. The bluestone site in Preseli, again, this is the spotted dolerite, and it just shows you what was going on across the landscape here, where all these major megalithic sites are connected with these different types of Pythagorean triangles, either the 5-12-13 red one or the yellow one, which is a 3-4-5. This was thousands of years before Pythagoras was even born, of course. And we have, if you continue the alignment of the Stonehenge, the Bluestone site, and continue it around the world, we actually have a great earth circle, again, suggesting this global connection with this ancient elite who were building these sites. Lundy Island, which is part of that great lunation triangle, is very intriguing. It's shaped like an elbow. It translates in certain Old English language to the elbow island, and it's marking this corner of this great lunation triangle, as we can see here on the bottom left. But on this, at this particular spot, a certain Mr. Heaven was digging around, and he found an 8'5" tall giant buried here on Lundy Island. This is an artist's impression. And around him were smaller skeletons also buried there as well. Later, an 8'2" skeleton was found, and the jawbone was so large that it could cover his chin and his beard. It was that big. And this is the same kind of traits we feature in our book Giants on Record about the American giants. And the shin bone of the skeleton reached from his foot halfway up his thigh. So we're talking about an extremely large person here. Again, this is the burial of this particular giant. So one of the things we get into, not in too much detail tonight, but today rather, is the geomancy of the giants. There's going to be a whole chapter in the book about this. In Wales, we get this. In Britain, we get it all over the country. But there's there are these traditions of, if you look in and start decoding the folklore, the traditions, the stories in ancient Britain, we find that they're relating to surveying the landscape, archaeoastronomy, ley lines, earth grids, earth energies, and all these kind of things that I've been interested in for years. And, you know, my research is sort of taking a tangent with these giants. It's kind of just fascinating me, but now it's all coming back to the things I was originally researching. And that's what these guys are up to. And there's evidence in Britain that this is certainly the case. We have alignments all the way down from Orkney that go through Avebury, West Kennet, and Stonehenge. This is actually Papa Westray here. This goes back to 3700 BC. This is an incredibly ancient site. We just visited here recently on one of our tours. This is the Ring of Brodgar on the mainland Orkney. And there's giant accounts from the 17 and 1800s that have been found in Maze Howe, which is the megalithic tomb associated with these sites, that were 9 to 10 feet tall, discovered within these particular constructions. Northwest Scotland, we have lots of accounts from Scotland. Jim's researching that for the chapter in the book. And giant skeletons were being dug up here in the 1800s. And all of a sudden, there came on thunder and lightning, wind and delugean rain, the like of which man had never heard or saw. And this is one of the stories that keeps popping up. And this was a book called Sowers of Thunder by the brilliant Anthony Roberts, who we're dedicating our book to, Giants of Stonehenge in Ancient Britain, because he realized that there are geomantic myths, there are stories that go way, way back, and when you disturb the graves of giants, great storms occur, as though a spell, like a piece of magic, an old magic has been placed over these specific giants' tombs. And so we're going to get into that in the book in detail, because it's a really important aspect. We've got many accounts all over the country, even related to stone circles, and it suggests they were high-level kind of sorcerers or shamans, and they had control of the weather. And this is part of the geomantic system that they worked with across the country. All over Scotland, we have accounts. Again, this is something that we're currently researching. We've got a giant sword here, which I photographed in the museum in Edinburgh. But also up in Scotland, we have these ridiculously complicated megalithic stone spheres, all perfectly geometric. Along the bottom there, we have the 5 platonic solids, again, thousands of years before Plato was even born. And these spirals are found carved all over the place on these spheres as well, in Newgrange, Malta, even in Tiwanaku in Bolivia, where I came across this in one of the museums in I think La Paz, sorry. And this is one, looks like one of the geometric stone spheres with 6 sides to it. And also here we have what's very much look like Scottish people who were also recorded in that museum. But in North America, we have the most accounts, more than anywhere else in the world. We dedicated a whole book to this. We put less than 20% of the accounts we'd accumulated over the years into the book. Here are 10 fine examples that we feature in the book. And they go all the way up to 18 feet tall. Most of these are kind of solid, verified cases. Some aren't, but many of them are actually from academic records. Most of them are from newspapers, town and county histories, journals, diaries of doctors, and other such things. But there's so many accounts now, probably going into over 1,000, maybe 1,400 in North America. This was actually created by our good friend Cecilia Hall before we finished the book and collected all the accounts, because it got so crazy with the accounts that if we'd actually put them all onto this image, it would have become a purple blur. So we kind of didn't do that. But this gives you a sense of where they kind of gather, where they've been found. But mainly they're in the Ohio Valley. And this is the prime, most powerful place where these giants have been found. Serpent Mound, even, there's been some found here. And this is obviously aligned like Stonehenge's, the various turnings of the year. Megaliths have been found there. They're originally standing in the top part of the site. Just around the 1890 time, Professor Frederick Ward Putnam of Harvard University, he was a biologist and an anthropologist. He did excavations at the site, and he potentially came across this, which is a giant skeleton in one of the so-called Edina mounds found at the site. And you clearly state that it says a 7-foot skeleton. I believe that's 7 foot as we see there without the shins and feet. So probably over an 8-foot tall skeleton. And more research has been done by the brilliant Jeffrey Wilson and Ross Hamilton. Ross Hamilton's actually our kind of mentor, who we call the godfather of giantology. And he, both of them really, have come across a new story where they collected some old records and found potentially a 9 to 10 foot tall skeleton found at Serpent Mound. But if we go into Nevada, this is the place that I've been researching over the last few years quite thoroughly. I've been here a couple of times. There's a Paiute oral history about the Saiti Ka giants, and these were red-haired, cannibalistic, ferocious kind of warrior giants who lived around this area. In 1904, an 11-foot skeleton was said to have been unearthed in the area. This is me just at Lovelock Cave last year. But an over 11-foot giant was discovered in this area. And this is actually Lovelock Cave, where from 1911 onwards, hundreds of accounts of stories of skeletons, bones, loads of artifacts, 10,000 artifacts were found within this cave. And some majorly large skulls were also found. So we have this tradition here that goes back before these discoveries by this lady here on the right, Sarah Winnemucca Hopkins, who talks about this war that took place between her people and the so-called red-haired Saiti Ka or Tula eaters. And then 50 or 40 years later, these discoveries were being made that backed up her stories that these great battles did take place. More evidence emerged when I was looking around some museums. This is actually at the main museum, the county museum in Nevada, in Carson City. And this on the left here is one of the sandals that were found at Lovelock Cave. And this I think this is size, what's it say there? Size 29. So it would be someone over 9 feet tall, we think. And so the fact that we're finding evidence on display at a museum, and then they make a joke about it called Bigfoot in the Great Basin, but actually they realize that they probably have more evidence than this all stashed away, including things like this are actually on display, these great giant pestle and mortars. But there's a lot going on here, and it's just not been researched. It's been brushed under the carpet. And also secret societies may have got involved. We have a story that one of the giant skeleton mummies, which many of them were mummified, this one was actually taken away to the Fallon Fraternal Society, boiled down, and the skeleton was then used in rituals. Also in this area, we have the great Winnemucca petroglyphs. And these are like up to 14,800 years old, potentially between then that date and 10,500 years old. Next to the other side of Pyramid Lake, next to Winnemucca Lake. And these are giant carved petroglyphs, which J.J. Ainsworth has been doing a lot of research on. And we visited here last year, had a thorough investigation. We've got a video up on YouTube. You can check it out. But we concluded that these were carved by giants. I mean, it sounds crazy. It sounds like a jump into conclusions. But we've seen a lot of petroglyph sites around the country and around the world. And these are ridiculous. These are ridiculously large, very high up, created by large hands. This is not just created by the local Paiutes, and they admit that there was something going on here long before they arrived, just 800 or 900 years ago. Also in the area there, I was flying around in my jetpack, and I spotted this. Now, this is a great geoglyph, which I found on the lake bed near Winnemucca. Here's a close-up of it here. And this has never been recorded, never researched, and we intend to investigate this because this could give some clues as to who was really involved here, going back that far back. This is the so-called pyramid of Pyramid Lake. This is the so-called Sphinx of Pyramid Lake, amazingly. And around this area, we have some of the oldest human remains found in the Americas. And you can see those listed in the graphic on the bottom left there, including Spirit Cave, which I also visited on my travels, Kennewick Man. And these are all very, very interesting because some of these have red hair. Some of them clearly are not classic Native American, genes. There's very unusual migrations moving in and out of this part of the world, which we get into a lot in our first book, Giants on Record. There's even this brilliant thing I spotted in the Fortean Times. This is back from like 1993. Someone sent me this, and I'm actually a subscriber to the Fortean Times. It's a British paranormal publication, and it has some really good examples. Actually, some of the accounts that we've been investigating. So this has been known about for a while, since at least the early 90s. And even John Michel, who was my mentor in Britain here, has written about these. But this particular one here, this Lompoc Rancho account, is very, very intriguing. It's a 12-foot skeleton, potentially dug up in 1833 with double rows of teeth and all these strange artifacts. I actually went to Lompoc Rancho in California. It's north of Los Angeles. And now it's the Vandenberg Air Force Base. So you can't go in there, especially if you're looking for 12-foot giants. But there's many more found all over this part of Southern California, not just Lompoc Rancho. We actually met a gentleman on a recent visit to California when I was speaking at Contact in the Desert, and we met up with this guy. We've done research on Catalina Island where hundreds of accounts of giants have been found. But he came up with this, and he showed us this giant pieces of bone. This is a normal size skull. I can't really give his name away, but until we get these analyzed. But the skull is a standard human skull, and you can see the side of the skull, the bone there, and how small it is on the skull compared to how big it is in these fragments that he's acquired. And this was found north of Lompoc Rancho, not too far from there. It could even be the Lompoc Rancho giant. The size of this is remarkable. We have this side bone of the skull. I forget the exact name. We also have like one of the ear bones, which is clearly about twice or three times the size, and also massive teeth. Which we don't know what these are. I've shown these to a couple of anthropologists. They suggest they could be bear teeth, but we've come across double rows of teeth, as in the Lompoc Rancho account. Some stories that they do have double teeth like this, so they actually join together. So more research needs to be done, but this is potentially the real evidence and potentially the DNA we can retrieve from this to actually get some solid proof as to who these giants really were. The double rows of teeth thing is quite interesting in itself. We find this all over North America. We do a whole chapter in our book about this. Numerous accounts here. By the way, this one on the right there is actually a recreation we did for the TV show. The person on the left there is actually a person, and that's quite worrying. But I've actually met people who've had double rows, who've had them removed when they were young. And many of them have giant traits. And after they read the book and saw the TV show, they actually realized that it's a reality. The giant genes are still all around North America. some of the accounts here just shows you we have many of these. We do a whole chapter in the book about this. Academic sources, dentists and doctors writing about it. We've been, debated with by certain anthropologists, which is now Jim's friend for some reason. And there's a problem here because, some researchers, this anthropologist believes, no, it's just the parlance of the time. It's the way people spoke. They described 2 rows of teeth. They meant the upper and lower jaw and things like this. But it doesn't make sense when you got a description of 3 rows of teeth on the upper jaw, which we found in Amelia Island off the coast of Florida, for instance. Here's another map put together by C. Hall, who's mapped where they've been found. So they're found all over North America, a whole bunch of them up in New England, Jim's area. So it really does seem like it's one of the traits of the giants, which we go into detail in the book. This image here is actually from 1828, from David Cusick's Sketches of Ancient History of the Six Nations. And he was a Tuscarora artist, wrote a lot about the different myths, and he described what was called the stone giants. Now, these are really intriguing. They were cannibals, and it was said that their skin was made of stone. And they think it may have happened by rolling around in the sand and leather in their skin and things like this. But they were in Northern California. And these rock giants or stone giants are said to have dwelt in caves and terrorized the local people, as you can see in this very realistic illustration. Being one of those smaller people would not be the wise choice at this time. And we have the megafauna as well existing in North America. Now, this is something that it didn't really cross our mind until we started looking into the work of Vine Deloria Jr. This is this gentleman here. He was actually the mentor of Ross Hamilton, who was our mentor. So technically, he's our mentor, even though we never met him. And his brilliant work goes way, way back. He collected accounts, stories, and traditions from many of the very aged elders of various tribes across North America, and collected them in a book called Red Earth, White Lies, and a couple of other of his books. And some of the stories we feature in Giants on Record. But what he's saying is that the giants were living at the same time as the megafauna. And so if that's the case, it must be at least 12,000 years old, because it's known the megafauna started dying out, pretty much died out and shrunk in size around 12,000 years ago, potentially after the Younger Dryas impact event, which in tradition in certain parts of North America is called the Dark Tent. He has an account from Mississippi, for instance. There had been a tribe of cannibals who feasted on the bodies of their enemies. They were called giants and utilized the mammoths as their burden bearers. They kept them closely herded as they devoured everything and broke down the forests. And this was the origin of the prairies. This cannibal race and the mammoth perished around the same time by a great epidemic, or possibly the Younger Dryas impact event. And so we've got mammoths and humans living at the same time in North America, accounted for in detailed stories and traditions passed down from generation to generation. Again, another account from 1762 talks about these giants. This is quite an interesting one. No such creatures of these have ever been seen alive by the Indians, but legend said, this is the modern Indians, but legend said they had once been hunted through the forest by men of gigantic stature, and that when the last of these men had died, God had destroyed their mighty prey in order to protect the present race of Indians. Again, the destruction of this mighty prey is 12,000 years ago or more. There's also stories of thunderbirds coming down to earth in the form of giants, and they were said to have been like the Watchers or Anunnaki even of ancient biblical tradition. And they would dig the ditches. They died of extremely old age, and they returned to the clouds as thunderbirds. This is something that kind of gets me, because these traditions in the Bible lands talk about these feathered robes that these so-called watchers would wear. And there are parallel stories in North America that we kind of feature in the book. This is another interesting account from the Pacific Northwest from Vine Deloria. And it reads, there was a large man who chiseled for a large beaver. He worked in vain, but he could not kill it. He cut the mother open, took the young ones and put them in the water. They said both the man and the beaver were giants. And then again, this goes back many thousands of years. So we have these strange stories that are being recorded from this extremely ancient time. But the whole origin of these giants in North America, in Britain, all around the world are, you know, shrouded in mystery still to this day. I think that's possibly one of the most intriguing aspects of this, is probably the story of the so-called Denisovans. Now, these teeth we see in this image here on the bottom left. This is actually a replica of the Denisovan teeth, and my hands holding them in the office of a dental anthropologist called Shara Bailey from New York University. And these were pretty much the descendants of an earlier people called Homo heidelbergensis, and these were known to have been around in South Africa, Europe, and other places at least 200,000 years ago, up to 400,000 years ago potentially. There's variations on these dates. Professor Lee Berger and also Professor Francis Thackeray, both of the university in South Africa, concluded that these giants were routinely over 7 feet tall. This goes back hundreds of thousands of years. And on the right there, the top right there, we actually have a fossilized thigh bone found, I believe, in Swaziland, and that's twice the size of a human, average human. So that's like talking 10 feet tall here. And even Cro-Magnon man, who was supposed to have emerged from nowhere in Europe around 44,000 years ago, was routinely recorded and documented as being over 7 feet tall. So we have these giants in our human timeline that are completely disregarded. And the Denisovans, there's evidence coming out now, and we've just seen a release of Andrew Collins and Greg Little's new book, friends and colleagues of ours who we've worked with over the years. And this is a sophisticated stone bracelet that was found in Denisova cave in Siberia. Dates to at least 40,000 years old. It has drill holes in it, which shouldn't have existed at that time. It has remarkable bone needles, first one ever discovered. This is the cave itself. But these teeth are what's caused the sensation, because these teeth have over twice the chewing surface of a standard human tooth. So when it was first discovered, it was thought to be a cave bear. And that's certainly not the case, because they realized it was actually an unknown strain of human when it was discovered. So we're talking an extremely large person, or someone with an extremely large jaw. But then they found these finger bones, which were robust and much larger than average. And even a skull fragment has been discovered, which is so thick they can't believe it's of a normal sized human being, or even of a human being. But the tests are in the process, and it's all happening. And so this Denisovan kind of people who have just been, discovered, really date back from 40,000 years to 200,000 years old, and were contemporary partly with the Neanderthal and also Homo heidelbergensis, and potentially Cro-Magnon man eventually, with all the migrations that took place. And you can see those here. This just shows you a close-up of that remarkable thigh bone that was discovered in South Africa, which is twice the size of a modern human being. And here we have the very interesting Cro-Magnon. This is one of the early kind of stories of, one of the early illustrations of Cro-Magnon man. Now let's think about this for a moment, because Cro-Magnon man is who we are, really. We are descended from Cro-Magnon man. That's what pretty much took over the planet 44,000 years ago onwards, and he emerged out of nowhere. He didn't have any predecessors, really, unless Denisovan ends up being one around. And so I'm simplifying it here. We go into detail in the book, obviously, but there's something mysterious about this, because where did he come from 44,000 years ago? That's the big question. The problem is that there are Cro-Magnon style tools, there are Cro-Magnon style skulls, and other pieces of the human skeleton were found in North America over 44,000 years ago, going back to 70,000, potentially 130,000 years. So how can that be? How can there be earlier people in the Americas before Cro-Magnon emerged in Europe? Because until recently, it was only thought that America was completely uninhabited until the arrival of the Native Americans across the Bering Land Bridge, which has now been pretty much proven not to be the case. We have a fantastic book by Graham Hancock, America Before. It's going to be featured in Denisovan Origins. We feature it in Giants on Record, putting it out there that actually civilization in America is tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands years older in some cases than previously thought. And so the influence in Europe could have come from North America. And this is the theory put together in the 1980s, originally by Jeffrey Goodman in his book, I've completely forgotten the name of it, American Genesis. And so we need to kind of look at this again. And I think this is one of the important aspects of researching this. But we're not going to go too much into the origins, but I think what we will see is that there is a Nephilim connection to North America. Now, this sounds kind of crazy. People kind of laugh at me when I say things like this. But there is some strange occurrences, strange discoveries found in North America. One of these is the Grave Creek Stone. This was found in a wonderful mound in West Virginia near a place called Wheeling. I visited this back in 2012. Over 8 foot, maybe a 9 foot skeleton, and other skeletons were found in here with these remarkable jaws and bones and artifacts. But one of these artifacts was the Grave Creek tablet or stone, which was found here. Now, this is intriguing in itself because according to the author of America BC, Barry Fell, who's a Harvard guy, he pronounced it was Phoenician or Punic, but so potentially Canaanite. And so we're looking straight away, for those that realize this, is that there's a direct connection with the area of the Bible lands hidden within a mound, probably buried there a couple of thousand, maybe 3,000 years ago. It's thought it possibly is Anadina Mound, which is one of the older ones we find in North America. So we have this, suddenly there's a connection with this potential writing. Other researchers like Alan Wilson, Baron Blackett, and others have suggested this writing may actually even be Welsh, connected with the Phoenicians or Canaanites. So there's a whole story still emerging, still not concluded about this, but this has caused one of the sensations, which should cause a sensation, as to the origins of the giants in North America. We also have this very curious artifact, which was recorded and witnessed in 1877. After his surrender, Chief Joseph, a renowned Nez Perce leader, handed over a small pendant to General Miles of the army. And after a few years, it was inspected, and it turned out to be an ancient Mesopotamian cuneiform tablet, which was later translated by Robert Biggs, who's a professor of Assyriology at the Oriental Institute of the Chicago University. And he found it was a sales receipt for a lamb dating back to 2042 BC. So what is that doing in the possession of a Native American chief? And as you can see with the quote here, the chief said that the tablet had been passed down in his family for many generations, and they inherited it from white ancestors. Chief Joseph said that white men had come among his ancestors long ago. So who were these people? Where did they really come from? Why were they bringing Sumerian tablets with them into North America? And so this is where this Nephilim connection becomes interesting, or this, at least this connection with the Bible lands. There's been a lot of research done by writers such as L.A. Marzulli, Fritz Zimmerman, and others, who have really put forward this Christian perspective of these giants in North America, claiming they did indeed exist here and they did come from the Bible lands. And there is the evidence I just showed you is kind of evidence of this. And so what's going on here? I mean, if we look at the stories of the area of the Bible lands, we do have accounts of giants. And this is again put together by Cecilia Hall. Fantastic research we've been working alongside for several years. And this is just some of the accounts from this area, including Baalbek and Israel and others. All the stories of Goliath all suddenly come alive here. There are biblical references to giants, sort of describing them in a matter-of-fact way in this part of the world. Some quite famous ones here, like there were giant Genesis and so forth. There were giants in the earth in those days, mighty men, which were of old men of renown. And then we have Numbers as well. Then we saw the giants, the sons of Anak, which come with the giants, and we in our own sight as grasshoppers, and so we are in their sight, and so on and so forth. We have another one further down, 3:11, talking about the king of Bashan, who was estimated to be 12 feet tall. And there's many of these stories keep coming out of this part of the world. These are just some accounts. There's evidence now that Goliath existed. There's been artifacts with his names carved on it. Even King Og of Bashan has his name carved on a place called Byblos in ancient Lebanon, which goes back many thousands of years. And so, let's before we get into the next section here, we've got another 10, 15 minutes of this, and then we're going to jump over to Jim. We have to question, who were these Nephilim? Who were these Watchers or Anunnaki? What's the story here? So I'll give you a quick outline of this before we move on to the next section. But the next site we're going to look at is involved in this. If we go way, way back, we don't know when this was. There's no clue to this. It could be thousands, it could be tens of thousands of years ago. Supposedly in the area of the Bible lands, potentially at Mount Hermon, there's different ideas about which mountain this was, that some Watchers arrived, kind of came down from, they were called Watchers, they were also called the Anunnaki. There's a bit of confusion here. The earliest people were really called the Anunnaki, or Anunnage, and these were said to be just like human beings, but they kind of changed form. They were more kind of almost light spiritual beings as such. Some people say they were aliens. We've got the whole Zachariah Sitchin kind of legacy to battle against here. But Christian O'Brien really was the guy who did it in The Shining Ones, and they were said to have come down from this so-called mountain, created the so-called Garden of Eden, but actually they were like human beings, and they developed agriculture. And they had very high arts and sciences already in place when they arrived here. They were doing this for hundreds of years, and there was some trouble in the ranks. A third wave came down. These were called the Watchers, and this third wave was slightly taller. They were also known as the Grigori, and they were giants. They were very tall, but not necessarily super-sized giants. And they were the ones who brought many more technologies with them. They bred eventually with the human females, started teaching the humans all these arts and sciences which the humans weren't supposed to have. And eventually they bred a race called the Nephilim, these monsters who were cannibalistic, ferocious warrior types who rebelled against their kind of kin, the Watchers or the Anunnaki. And Enki, who's the great leader, decided to we've had enough of this. We're going to create a great flood to get rid of them. And this is the flood, the famous great flood of Noah, and it was said to have wiped out the whole Garden of Eden, took out all the Nephilim, but some survived. There's even stories of King Og of Bashan clinging on to Noah's Ark in different accounts. And eventually some of them did survive, some carried on, and they spread around the world. And this is the story where they then spread through Europe, into Britain, other countries, North America, and so on and so forth. But before we leave the Bible lands, there's one site which is changing archaeology, it's changing everything. This is a site called Gobekli Tepe. Now this, I believe, there's me there posing with Graham Hancock a few years ago, I believe this is the game changer when it comes to understanding not only megalithic science and the origins of the megalithic people, but also the story of the Watchers, the Anunnaki, and even the Nephilim. I think this is one of their sites, the first site, built potentially just after the flood, probably 12,000 or so years ago. There's some remarkable things carved on the stones here. There's alignments to various stars. We're not going to get into it all now. There's been a huge amount of analysis done on this by Andrew Collins, Hancock, and others. These are some of the other sites in this area, and this really is the area just north of the whole kind of traditional Garden of Eden. We have this serpent symbolism as well, we find, which is, I think, a trait of these giants, especially the elites of these giants. This serpent was found, this head serpent thing was found actually in the Vali Churi, which is nearby. It's now on display in the museum in San Lierfa. And the serpent was the symbol Enki. He was the great serpent. He was the serpent in the Garden of Eden that gave the apple of knowledge to Eve and so forth. It wasn't actually a serpent, who could speak or anything. This was actually, Enki was the great leader below the kind of godlike kind of demigod figures. And yeah, there's more here. There's Earth of Man, which is being discovered, this remarkable statue found nearby. And there's just so much going on here. It's too much to explain it. But the quality of the carving, the sophistication, the abstract artistic rendition carved into solid limestone is astonishing here at the ancient site of Gobekli Tepe, which goes to at least 12,000 years old. However, when we were with Klaus Schmidt there in 2014, who was the head German archaeologist, he claimed, no, this is actually much older. It could go back to 14,000 years old. And so it may have been built even before the flood. And then they deliberately covered it up, with, a huge mound of earth, which became known as the navel or the belly hill. And the flood may have happened afterwards and so forth. So there's different stories about this, but the associations here are connected with these biblical giants, in my opinion. And these traits keep coming out and keep emerging all over the world. This is a bone plaque that myself and Andrew and our friend Matt discovered. Well, not discovered, it was on display in the museum. We were the first ones to actually notice it and photograph it. And this shows a very early depiction of a gentleman standing at Gobekli Tepe, staring between the pillars of Gobekli Tepe itself. We also find the symbolism of the T-shaped pillars in different parts of the world, suggesting potentially a global connection. This is actually in Menorca. This one is in Amarumuru in ancient Peru. This is the site called Karahan Tepe, which is near Gobekli, but it's not been excavated. You can't go there. We can't really go there anymore. We've been there a few times because they're now excavating there. And this is one of the unfinished T-shaped pillars found at Gobekli Tepe. There's me and my friend Kevin, who came on one of our tours out there. And look at this serpent symbolism we find all over the site. And to me, this is not entirely a symbol of the giants. It's more a symbol of the Watchers or the Anunnaki, who were the, predecessors of the so-called giants who came later. But look, their symbols are being found everywhere. On the left there, we have Gozo, which is next to Malta, which now new dating has put that back to the time of Gobekli Tepe. And we're going to be presenting that information at the Origins Conference in London on November the 16th. In the middle, we have Gobekli Tepe, and on the right there, we have Saqqara. This is actually in the museum in Saqqara. And this is the symbol of Enki, the serpent of wisdom and healing. And so we've got a lot, we've got through quite a lot here. I'll give you a few little snippets of some other aspects of this before we move over to Jim's lecture. But some areas that I've been researching, I'm really enjoying exploring the Mediterranean and Europe, Sardinia specifically. We're doing a lot of research here. We've been there a few times. We run tours there now every summer, every May, June time. It's actually got giant skeletons, 9 foot and 8.5 foot skeletons were found there. There's ziggurat type pyramids on Sardinia, which are found very close to the giants. These are older than the pyramids of Egypt. And there are many of these so-called giants' graves, which we can see on the top there on the left, and these beautiful hypogeums on the top right there. And so there's something going on around the Mediterranean, which we've just started really beginning excavating. We find it in Italy as well. Many of these great skeletons are found. We have 1807, Captain James Allen of the ship Jupiter that came from Philadelphia, describes a 10.5 feet tall skeleton found buried deep with these strange carvings on this tablet found on the coast of Italy. Also in Italy, we find on the top right there's Italy, we find these polygonal walls, which I believe are a trait of these giants. We find them obviously in Peru, on the top left there. On the bottom left, we have the Giza Plateau. Bottom right, we have Easter Island. And these are the ones in Italy. And I'm just going to flick through these. And you can, if you want to go to YouTube, you can see my videos. I've been exploring Italy and this area around the Mediterranean for a few years now. This is the Latry, which featured in a recent episode of Ancient Aliens, which I put them onto. This is some of the megalithic blocks, and these were all said to be built by giants. This is Ferentino, Segni, Norba, And it goes on and on and on. There's JJ discovering this remarkable drill hole showing high levels of technology. We also find this kind of thing in Albania, in Turkey, Elajahoyak and Hattusa. Also in Greece, we have very strong stories of megalithic Greece, going very far back. And of course, this is the origins of the Cyclopean giants. And we even met a Cyclops cat at Delphi. He's got one eye, so hence the name. But all over this part of the world, we're finding the same kind of things. This kind of origins of these giants going way, way back. In South America, we have Viracocha, who is said to have created a race of giants and built the megalithic sites for him all along the path of Viracocha, Tiwanaku, Pumapunku, Machu Picchu. This is actually a skull that was found at Pumapunku. But what's really interesting is there are strong connections, like we find in Peru, as we find in the Bible lands. Not only do we have an almost identical carving, the two on the top there are Gobekli Tepe, the two on the bottom there are Silistani and Kutimbo around Lake Titicaca, almost identical style. We find the serpent style found in all these different locations as well. But what's really intriguing to me is the Fuente Magna Bowl, which was found in 1953 around the edge of Lake Titicaca, only a few miles from Tiwanaku. But it has this, it's made of stone, it's made of sandstone, it's not ceramic as some people suggest. It was used to feed pigs for a while, so I can't really believe it's a hoax. And it's been translated to this Proto-Sumerian script going back to around 2000 BC. So there are translations. You can find these online. You can also find them in David Hatch-Childress' book about this. Also the Pakoitia monolith, which was found nearby, which has these strange Sumerian style inscriptions. They're also wearing this kind of headgear, which is remarkably similar to what we find in that part of Sumeria and Mesopotamia. This was found again at Pakoitia. And we find similar things all over the place, making these strange connections. Now, I'm just going to quickly run through the giants of Egypt before we hand over to Jim, and then we're going to get into some other different aspects of this research that we've been doing. Now, Egypt is obviously a fascinating place, not just because of the pyramids and pharaohs and all that kind of stuff, but actually there's a huge amount of evidence of giants being involved in the construction of these sites. At the Temple of Edfu, we have the Edfu building texts, and they talk about times going back tens of thousands of years and giants involved in the construction of these sites. There's a place called Hierakonpolis in southern Egypt near Abydos, where a giant king called Keskemwe, you can see him on the right there, is on display in the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford. One of the earliest kings in the early second dynasty, and he was said to be over 8.5 feet tall. And this has been recorded by Manthio back in 2,000 years ago. We also have this giant finger that was found in a tomb near the Giza Plateau, which is a mummified finger. It's been x-rayed, investigated, and it's so large you can see the Egyptian note next to it that it must have been someone over 16 feet tall. This was Gregor Spory. You can Google and find out about his research on this. There's these giant sarcophagi found all over Egypt, including the Serapeum, of course, which is said to be the burial place of Apis bulls, but perhaps it wasn't. We have artwork found all over Egypt as well that we've been investigating, and we are going to investigate, which sort of indicates giant beings. But we go back to the Arabian myths, going back to the year over 1,000, maybe 1,500 years ago. There's a book called the Book of Wonders that claims that the people of Ad were giants who built the monuments of Dashur. And they placed secrets in the pyramids of Dashur and other pyramids to imitate what had been done of old, which I believe they're talking about geometry, measure, the polygonal construction. And he also founded the city of Dendera. So we have two sites that have been recorded as being created and founded by giants. Also, it says that the first king of Egypt after the flood was a giant who erected high towers and monuments. And the city of Memphis, the ancient capital, was the work of a later set of giants. with insurmountable strength, and he ordered the quarrying of rocks and their transportation to build pyramids, as has been done in former times. So this is some of the stuff we've been investigating. Now, this is just tip of the iceberg. If you want to read a two-part article I've written, go to ancient-origins.net and Google Giants of Egypt, and you'll find it. And also, you can join us, of course. Me and Jim are doing a trip out to Egypt in November, where we're going to be investigating this, and we've got access to some sites, including this particular tomb, which has paintings on the walls that may give the final proof of who these giants really were. And so I'm going to pretty much finish up here and let Jim take over, and we'll move on to the next section. So we hope you can join us on some of these trips. We hope you can check out our books and our websites and so forth. And thanks for listening, and on to part 2 with Jim Vieira.
All right. Can you hear me, Hugh? Nice cat. Okay. Here we go. How's the audio, Hugh? Let's see here.
It sounds good, Jim. Just just press the share button, and then that people can, and then you got to press confirm that, and then it'll be up on the screen.
Gotcha. There. And I will, second please. Slideshow. I have the tech skills of an Amish preacher. Let's see. Here we go, right?
Yeah, that's all good. That's all good.
Okay. Let me get rid of this. So, thank you for being here. I'll describe a little of my background. Let's see here. Okay, here we go. I'm a stonemason by trade. I studied economics. I'm from Boston, as you might be able to ascertain. I got to say, I was frankly a real skeptic about the idea of giants and a lot of ancient mysteries that are very popular now. I come from a scientific background. I would read academic documents and watch PBS specials ad nauseum, and I really didn't see much veracity to these arguments. And then I kind of fell into the whole mystery of giants by accident, studying a tangential mystery in New England, being a stonemason and trying to figure out if Native Americans built stonework here. But honestly, to me, it just seems like it's ubiquitous. Every inch of the globe has some evidence of giants, whether it's rock art with 6 fingers and toes, or some reports or giant lore. And I'm going to try to give a broad view of this through comparative analysis. I study Rudolf Steiner, Edgar Cayce, Madame Blavatsky, oral traditions. I do ceremonies with wisdom keepers all around the world. I'm not averse to San Pedro and peyote and ayahuasca ceremonies. I'll do anything for a good story and to get to the root of what's going on here. And for me, it's a metaphysical story, and it goes back to the lost continent of Atlantis, Hugh's favorite place. So I will get into that too. I will try to anticipate your questions, like where do the giants come from? Why are some malevolent? Why are some benevolent? Are they the wisdom keepers? Are they the geomancers of old? And so I will give this broad outline from the view of comparative analysis, but I'll go through these different aspects and try to weave the story all together. So I've done a series of shows for history. Hugh, my brother, and I did Search for the Lost Giants. We did Roanoke specials. I've appeared on Expedition Unknown with Josh Gates. I've appeared with Megan Fox, Uncharted on the Science Channel. Last month, Code of the Wild, the Ecuador Giants for the Travel Channel. And I just filmed a spot for Ancient Aliens. So Hugh and I keep appearing on different shows and sharing our research. As Hugh had mentioned, we wrote this book together, Giants on Record. One thing I would like to point out is that the incontrovertible science that makes your cell phone work cannot be applied with ancient understanding of the past. Anthropology, archaeology, history, they're all educated guesses. And I am not anti-science at all, and I don't believe in academic conspiracies. There's real conspiracies in the world. You know, you want to investigate JFK and 9/11. There is tons of evidence that something fishy is going on. Even Jeffrey Epstein just occurred. So I'm not against the idea of conspiracy, although it is, sent out there as a pejorative, like somehow you're unhinged if you entertain these ideas. But academics are essentially involved in like an atheistic cult. And once again, I'm not anti-science. It's just I know the thinking of scientists, and it is very, there is no allowance of the spiritual, metaphysical side. Now, Pythagoras, Plato, all the great scientists of old were metaphysical geniuses. They understood the holographic nature of reality. They understood why the universe was created and how we're all connected to this quantum grid and how the mind creates reality. And modern day science is kind of a cold Cartesian, left brain, male dominated version of reality that is lacking in many ways. Just like the healthcare system, they don't take a holistic approach to figure out the past. So I get into the mystics, I get into oral traditions and religious documents and academic sources and try to give a more holistic approach to the past. So one of the things I've encountered is this persistent idea that humans were created by an extraterrestrial species, which I firmly believe now. I'm not going to get into that. Silva has a great book if you're interested in this idea. If you're listening to this webinar, you're already open to these ideas anyways. What I'll say is that I've come to believe through all these sources that not only were Homo sapiens created by an extraterrestrial genetic intervention, the giants were created by these same ancient alien gods. All the alien gods who show up all around the planet, from Viracocha to Fuxi in China to Oannes, they are all specifically noted to be androgynous and hybrid beings. Androgyny is a strange trait that keeps appearing. And they're creating humans on potter's wheels, like at the Temple of Esna. The androgynous god Khnum is making humans. And the Dogon people in Mali, Africa, they have these oral traditions that state that the Nomo were from Sirius. These androgynous creator gods were from Sirius. So it ties the whole story in, like why, like Oannes, the fish god who shows up in Samaria, he has that man bag and he's half fish and half man, and he teaches the arts of civilization just like Viracocha, but he is specifically known to be androgynous. I'm saying it's this sexless advanced being basically. So take what you want of that, but the level of specificity all around the world of this particular trait and this association with giants is very remarkable. So the giants are associated with the lost world of Atlantis. Now, I'll look back to how I got into this thing about 20 years ago. I was studying old town and county histories, and here you have George Sheldon in Deerfield, Massachusetts. Now, he gives this account in his town history, where it states, one of these skeletons was discovered to me by Henry Math, who saw it, as being of monstrous size, the head as big as a peck basket with double teeth all round. Skeleton was examined by Stephen Williams. He said the owner must have been nearly 8 feet high. But what was remarkable about that is the double rows of teeth were noted. Now, I went to the museum where Hugh and I did, where that was founded by George Sheldon, and he had a scrapbook of accounts of giant skeletons. And I was like, whoa, this guy must have been on to something. He was an archaeologist. He was a Massachusetts state senator. He was a brilliant, open-minded thinker. And it really got me going. Like, maybe there's something to the story. In fact, on page 83 here, you have a list of bones that were at the museum. And one was an over 8-foot femur from Marion, Ohio, that he had delivered. George Sheldon had delivered by another archaeologist. It was on display. I spoke with my friend who's an anthropologist who repatriated several years ago as part of the Native American Repatriation Act of 1990. So on display, they had a giant femur at this museum near where I live of an over 8-foot individual. So here are some of the accounts I've uncovered all throughout New England in the town and county histories of double rows of teeth. So here we have a skeleton, must have been 7 foot 8 inches, and it had double row of teeth in each jaw. And here's another one right here. I'm just showing you these so, you know, to show you the original source. But here we go. Rockingham, Vermont. A remarkable human skeleton was found. The jawbone was such size that a large man could easily slip it over his face, over the face. And the teeth, which were double, were all perfect. They're going out of their way to mention massive jawbones and double rows of teeth. And these are just, you know, respected town historians chronicling these finds. This is from Minnesota. Each had double rows of teeth in front as well as the back part of the jaw. Here's Noble County. The Bates Mound was open. The remarkable feature of these remains was that they had double teeth in front as well as in back in the upper and lower jaws. So over 8-foot skeletons, they're going out of the way, you know, the remarkable feature. So this to me is a reality. This is a time of inefficient communication. These are not hoaxes. These are respected scientists oftentimes who are reporting this. Even in Scientific America, some wonderful skulls found in California are reported having double teeth all the way around the jaw. As Hugh showed you, it's a rare genetic condition, much like 6 fingers and 6 toes. Chris Coombs in this wonderful book, The Giant of Wheels, gives this account, and it's about 200 AD. In the time of Hadrian the Emperor, there was raised from the earth in a place called Messana, which is Carthage, the body of the giant of Ida, who was 20 feet in length and who had double sets of teeth or 2 rows of teeth still standing completely preserved in his head or gums. So a 20-foot giant in Carthage in 200 AD is unearthed, and it exactly lines up with the double rows of teeth anomaly found all over ancient America, dug up by the settlers. Remember, the Native Americans would never touch the mounds of their ancestors or the giants or whomever. They basically left them untouched for thousands and thousands of years. And the settlers over a 150-year period ravaged all the burial places of the ancient ones. And what they found is accounts like this. A skeleton in the New York Times. The skull was as large as a half-bushel measure, over 9 foot tall. They're using the parlance of the time to discuss how large the skull was. As full as a half-bushel measure is absolutely enormous, well out of normal range, over 9 foot tall. We're not talking about NBA players. We are talking about genetic freaks that have no similarities to current Homo sapiens. That's what 9 foot tall looks like. That's pituitary gigantism that Robert Waldo had from Alton, Illinois. Charles Huntington, he was there when doctors Larkin and Cheney unearthed an over 9 foot skeleton in Canandaigua, New York. He took the measurements and he made this model of the over 9 foot skeleton. I spoke with his granddaughter. She said he was perfectly sane. He was an inventive guy. He's very, very bright, and he couldn't get the size of the bones out of his head, but they crumbled eventually away to dust. And he took the measurements and made this skeleton. And they were housed in they're housed in the Smithsonian and in the New York State Geological Center as well. 9 foot tall, 28-inch length shin bone, 14 inches long in length, and 35 inches across the shoulder. Once again, at Buffalo and DC, these measurements are noted, dug up by these respected doctors. So what I'm displaying here, these aren't all, you know, crackpot, clickbait of the time kind of headlines to get you to read a story. They're buried obscurely in town and county histories. Right here, over 9 foot tall. The femur bone is a yard long. That's 36 inches. Utterly, astoundingly huge. Massive underjaw, much larger than that of the ordinary man. So if the jawbone is fitting over the face of the largest man in town over and over again, there's a story here. You just don't cook that up as some like hoax or something like that. Now, even professionals in the 50s found enormous skeletons. Right here, 7 foot 2 inch by Don Dragoo from the Carnegie. And on the right is that the far right skeleton is the 7 foot 2 person. Right here's a picture of the skeleton. At the Dover Mound in Kentucky in 1952, another 7 foot tall skeleton was found. Now, what's interesting about this is that these noted scientists picked out the trait of the massive jawbone, and they called it the Adena jaw. The Adena were the first of the mound builders going back about 1000 BC, and they built these burial mounds in different geometric forms around ancient America. And they are noting that the Adena people were huge and robust and elongated their skulls and had massive jawbones. So it's really interesting that noted scientists are pointing out what the rest of these accounts are pointing out as well. In 1965 at DeSoto Cave, they found an over 7-foot skeleton. Joseph Langley Benthal, Alabama archaeologist, found the skeleton in 1965, over 7 foot tall, and he noted that the jawbone was so massive it could fit over his face. And they reburied the remains in the cave as part of the Native American Repatriation Act. So once again, a noted scientist is picking up on utterly bizarre anatomic measurements. And here we have 7,000-year-old skulls and skeletons over 7 feet tall. Santa Barbara Museum of Natural History, 1959. Look at the skull on the right, absolutely massive. It's at the Texas Archaeological Research Lab. I'd like to get it genetically tested, DNA tested, and to learn more about it. Now, I'm not saying these giants were not Native American, as some people do. I think they were giant Native American chiefs that were the wisdom keepers and the shamans that I believe came from Atlantis, as strange as that sounds. And they migrated here after the flood, and they migrated out to the British Isles, and we have the same stories there: advanced geometry, advanced spiritual teachings, similar beliefs in the reality of the eternal reality of the soul. All kinds of specific things are noted, and they specifically note that they're from a lost continent in the middle Atlantic. So, you know, I really believe you have this flow out from Atlantis. We know that the Younger Dryas impact event and massive flood occurred 12,800 years ago, as verified by science. We know that the Clovis barrier, the idea of people only coming to America about 12,000 years ago, starting 12,000 years ago, has been debunked. We know out of Africa is a mess, and we don't really, through an anthropological lens, be able to understand our origins. So all theories are open at this point. And I point to the mystical sources, the religious sources, and the oral traditions of indigenous people to tell this alternate story. In our show right here, we found evidence of this 8-foot skeleton in the microfilm. Right here, these giant skulls, that's a ruler on the bottom and a thigh bone. That's probably 26, 27 inches long. This is from the Ozarks, 7 and 2.5 inch skeleton. Now, you might say, well, that's only 7 foot 2, but the amount of 7 foot and tall skeletons found in the burial mounds of ancient America is of a much higher percentage than 7-footers occur in our normal population today, indicating survivors from a lost world, an ancient link to the giants of the past. And scientists view this like, no, evolution, we evolved from Australopithecines. There is no place for giants. It's this, and giants is a religious idea too. So it's considered, you know, basically verboten. We have like an atheistic, logic-based, quote unquote, data-driven discipline that doesn't respect thousands of years of oral traditions and religious documents, as if they were conjured out of thin air about nothing. But all those sources are saying the same specific thing about the past, and all the evidence appears to be there. Now, right here, the head of the Carnegie, Dr. Holland, unearthed between an 8 and 9 foot skeleton in Pennsylvania, listed in Scientific America. And this is a really interesting one, the Chickasaw Mound. Right here, the records of the past. And this is at the, what's the museum in Chicago that has the big T-Rex? The Field Museum, and that has Sue the T-Rex. One of the scientists in the early 1900s, they found a 29-inch femur bone. That's a 9-foot tall skeleton. And listen to what this accredited archaeologist says. The skulls are extremely large. The jaw is of such size that it would slip over my own face and have considerable space to spare. So you have farmers, you have doctors, lawyers, professionals, all reporting the same thing. Now, in 1897, this is one of my favorite accounts here, we have the Miamisburg giant was found, massive jawbone, 8 foot 1.5 inches, There's a sketch of it there. Anthropologists from all around the country joined the excavation, were stunned by the find. And in the middle of this article, you can see they list it with the greatest giants of all time, like Charles Byrne, the giant of Ireland, and other accounts. This is the quote from Thomas Wilson, head of Smithsonian Anthropology Department, who analyzed the skull. The authenticity of the skull is beyond doubt. Its antiquity unquestionably great. To my own personal knowledge, several such crania were discovered in the Hopewell group of mounds in Ohio. So he is verifying this find, which is quite astonishing, in the Smithsonian's own documents. Now, this man, Heckelwelder, lived with the Delaware Indians, and he writes all about their oral traditions. And he talks about their legends of giants that was specifically talked about, this ancient war of the native people with the giant ones, with the cannibalistic giants that existed before the flood and sometimes after the flood, but in much diminished numbers. And you have the same story around the world. All the native tribes have these traditions. And oddly enough, they have traditions of little people too, which I won't get into here. But just like Ireland and Scotland, the legends of the little ones are ubiquitous as well as giants. Now, the question people want to know is there some vast conspiracy involved? And I would say science is agenda driven. Science is very closed-minded, if you will. There's a non-holistic approach. Science was reconfigured after the Dark Ages, and they lost all the wisdom of the Library of Alexandria or the intuition of the great mystics. Like Pythagoras was like this flamboyant and mystical sage who would heal people. And he was a vegetarian who basically fasted and meditated. You know, these weren't guys just in a lab all the time. They were intertwined with the mystical realms. So we have, like I said, a reconfiguration of science that occurred in the late 1800s. But there was a lot of racism at the time. And the idea that Native Americans had a grand and incredible past was diminished and dismissed and marginalized. You can't destroy a culture and revere it at the same time. So Native people were portrayed as unremarkable, nomadic, unsophisticated, where we know the reverse is true. They built geometric forms, pyramids of earth, sophisticated math and geometry, just like the British Isles and Sumeria and the Mayan Empire. All around the world, the same wisdom was shared. So the Native people had this incredible past. And the story you get of the Smithsonian is just like, oh, you know, they're hiding all the evidence in the warehouse. Now, I'm not saying there isn't funny business going on, but your rank and file anthropologist and archaeologist, I'm not going to throw under the bus. I'm just going to say it's like your doctor. They study like an allopathic form of archaeology where everything is symbolism. They don't say, wow, this figure, this hybrid figure with like a strange man bag is carved and revered as a culture hero all around the planet. Should we look further into that? Could this be a reality? No, it's like, these people were strange and superstitious and just didn't understand, you know, hard and fast science. And I disagree with that. So one of the heads of anthropology, or the first head of anthropology, was Dr. Hrdlicka for the Smithsonian. And he was a hardcore racist. I'm not going to get into all his quotes that are despicable, but the guy was a real a-hole. And he was the one who declared giants no more in the 30s. Although the Smithsonian's own records, I will show, had many accounts of giant skeletons found by their own scientists. Now, this is the first head of the Eastern Mounds Division. This is Powell of Grand Canyon excavation fame. And he had this old world view of thinking everything, you know, basically the natives were savage and barbarous, and we were the civilized ones, say the white interlopers in the United States. So it's the same old tired racist idea about Native people or African Americans. And this is what they based their basically evolution on. It was this weird mix of science and racism. And you can't really trust too much of what was going on at the time. But this is when all these theories were formed. So the Smithsonian gets giant skulls. It is listed in academic journals. They send their scientists out. They find over 7-foot skeletons, over 8-foot skeletons. They essentially find that there was the remnants of giants among the native people. Even all the early explorers encountered giant people in Patagonia, in Virginia with John Smith. Coronado, DeSoto, Tuscaloosa in Alabama, him and his son were over 8 foot tall, as noted by the chroniclers. All the early explorers say the same thing. Now here's a Smithsonian ethnology report, one of many, and within it, here's a 7.5 foot skeleton, 19 inches across the chest by Professor Norris. It was written about here, and it shows up in the New York Times. And here's another one, over 8 foot tall. I don't know what 20 teeth is all about. That skeleton in the front is close to 7.5 foot tall. This is in Nelson Mound. Look at all the beehive mounds in North Carolina. Right here, over 9 foot skeleton, burial mound of giant race hold secret. And many of these were either dug up by Smithsonian scientists or sent to the Smithsonian. And here's my favorite account found by my buddy Micah Ewa. In 1873, T.M. Perrin, the Smithsonian archaeologist, reports in Illinois, the skulls are very large but fall to pieces upon being exposed to the air. One skull was found that measured 36 inches in circumference. That is absolutely enormous. I mean, a normal skull is, you know, probably 30% of that. So the point is, many of these skulls were found. They were absolutely enormous, found by a Smithsonian scientist. But because this idea is like, you know, it's like religion and politics. I will yield nothing to the other side. Now, the biblical-oriented people will say giants existed. It's in the Bible. The skeptic or the academic will say that's a bunch of nonsense. And I'm not going to even, you know, yield an inch, because that means evolution is wrong. That means there was a supernatural aspect at work where humans and giants were created by an extraterrestrial race. My colleagues will mock me endlessly if I even talk about that. So I've given up my hope of being respected in mainstream circles, and I am just geared towards the truth, and I do it through the means of comparative analysis. So a few of the sources that claim giants is a historical reality: Rosicrucians, Freemasons, Theosophists, the Bible, other religious documents, Casey Steiner, and oral traditions around the world. Now, what all those sources also say, oddly enough, is that Atlantis was a historical reality, existed in the middle of the Atlantic, was destroyed 12,600 to 800 years ago, verified by the Younger Dryas impact event, and that these androgynous created gods created giants that were part of the population of Atlantis, and some of them survived after the flood. They all say that, which is extremely odd because they come from different backgrounds, secret societies, mystics. They are not in contact with each other through ages of time. Even Plato talks about Atlantis, the Great Flood, and androgynous gods creating humans, which nobody knows about because we only listen to the sane stuff that Plato said. So it's really fascinating undercurrent here. And the idea of giants is linked inexorably to megalithic construction, as Hugh talked about. Now, here is Sacsayhuaman in Peru. Now, I'm a stonemason and an engineer, so I'll get into what I think about these sites. So the Incas specifically told the Spaniards that Sacsayhuaman was not built by them, but the giants, that the giants were the one who built these incredible stone structures. This isn't like wishful thinking. These are noted in the chroniclers' diaries that the Inca told them specifically about this. So that's what they have to say about, you know, you would think if it's part of their past, there'd be this proud tradition of like, yes, our ancestors built this. No, the Viracochas, the giants, the flood survivors built these incredible stone structures. Now, the entire world is littered with inexplicable stone structures. And if you landed on this planet from another world, you would say, oh my God, the past of this place is so bizarre. There clearly was an advanced civilization and a lost world. And the science is like a bad superstition that believes in gradualism or uniformitarianism, and none of them make sense. Like, you have a story, like, why doesn't everything fit neatly into this idea of modern science? Instead, we have these wild and bizarre stories in our mythology, in our oral traditions, in our religious documents that tell a completely different story. So here you see Sacsayhuaman. I'll go back here for a sec. One of the ideas is that the molecular bonds of these stones were weakened and that these sites were built by a technology that is now lost to us. Now I'll give Edgar Cayce, the great mystic's take on it. Now Cayce was a mystic who lived, he was born in 1877, lived in Kentucky. You probably know about him already. He is the godfather of holistic medicine, and he had many readings in a trance-like state about Atlantis. And this is one of the readings that he gave. He was asked the question, give a few details regarding the physiognomy, habits, customs, and costumes of the people of Atlantis just before the first destruction. It took on many sizes as to stature, from that as may be called the midget to the giants, for there were giants in the earth in those days, men as tall as what would be termed today 10 to 12 feet in stature and well proportioned throughout. Now, he specifically notes that they were part of the Atlantean population, and Steiner says the same thing, Madame Blavatsky, and all these other sources. So this is the story of Vieira, the androgynous god, that he made earth and sky, fashioned from stone a race of giants. Displeased with them, he turned some of the giants back into stone and destroyed the rest in a flood. Now, what Cayce says is that Vieira is a descendant from Atlantis, and that the Atlantean colonists landed in Sacsayhuaman and Cusco and around Pumapunku, and they are the ones that created the incredible megalithic sites. Now, as a stonemason, I see a level of expertise that is beyond the capabilities of the people of the time. You have these incredible fits. You have miles of seams that you can't get a micron between them. Forget about a razor blade. You have cataclysmic evidence like this staircase flipped upside down at Sacsayhuaman. Ollantay Tambo, this is, I think it's granite or andesite, I'm not sure. It's a particularly hard stone. But look at the shims, the earthquake shims that are flawless. That is so hard to do. I can't tell you. You could have the tools of the time, and I could have 1,000 years, and I could not duplicate that. And the master masons on the planet could not do that. That to me, it's an episode idea for a future show, is to take some blocks of the available stone with the available tools and see if these can be recreated. I believe not. I will stick whatever reputation I have behind that. And you look, and the stone almost seems to be softened and reshaped. And these are just astounding megalithic structures. Ollantay Tambo here. They interlock in the back. This requires planning and mathematics and engineering. And Cayce said they were built by Atlantean colonists using light, sound, and levitation technology. And Cayce, in fact, says that the Great Pyramid of Egypt was built in 12,400 to 12,300 BC by Atlantean colonists who used the same technology. Now, we know through studying the work of Chris Dunn and others, there is high technology all around Egypt as well. I'm not saying all the pyramids are that old, but some structures appear to be built right after the last flood. Now, I'm just showing you different images of this kind of stonework. You see the Inca stonework and then the megalithic stuff after it. Polygonal walls, incredible fits. The appearance of the softening of stone as well. Here's Brian Forrester and I on a tour discussing this. This was in the 50s. Archaeologists found this in Cusco. They found an Inca wall in front of the ancient megalithic wall built by the Vieira. Now, this is proof, there are so many examples of this, that the Inca built this kind of, mediocre stonework that, me and a crew of 20 guys had whipped together or something like that. The stuff behind it is a different matter as well. So what happened was they removed the entire wall, and this is what it looks like today. In the far upper left, that lousy stonework is the Spanish stuff. The pre-Incan megalithic stuff is in front, and the Inca megalithic wall is gone. So that is a kind of a tell that this ancient stuff is much more sophisticated, which flies in the face of normal progressions of technological evolution. Here we have the Temple of the Sun, Coricancha. It looks like a CNC machine made this vault, if you will. At Machu Picchu, the same thing. It's like the stuff was easy. It was like showing off almost, because you couldn't pull a lot of the stonework off in the way it was supposed to be done. When the first Spanish chroniclers arrived with Pizarro, the Inca explained that Tiwanaku had been constructed by a race of giants called Huaris before the period of darkness and was already in ruins before their own civilization began. So all these ancient sources in isolated areas are saying the same thing about the megalithic construction. They had no means of communication. I find that extremely curious that they all cook up the same story, if you will, that giants built these ancient sites. Now, Tiwanaku has been dated much earlier by Arthur Poznansky and others. I will just say that his Poznansky there, that the expertise at the site, the stonework expertise is astonishing. Here's Pumapunku, here's me with my awesome cat shirt, and these planes that I see are evidence of some kind of machining, if you will. Now, the tools aren't there, so there's a lot of consternation about how they were built. And once again, Casey says these people developed this almost mystical technology of levitation and cutting and stone softening that doesn't leave tools behind. And, you know, I'll just put that out there, that it's a really compelling argument that Casey makes. So we find these giant skulls in Bolivia. We find elongated skulls all around the world. Now, I'll stop for a second and say the entire planet is littered with elongated skulls. It is the most extreme and bizarre thing to do to your child, like cradle board them. And just to say that they all independently created that, you know, extreme adaptation or manipulation by themselves, that doesn't make any sense. Now, I've talked to very well-respected anthropologists, and they kind of brush it off, and I'm like, no way. I mean, isolated Pacific Islands, native tribes, Middle East, this is everywhere. And the obvious truth is they're emulating somebody. They're emulating the creator gods or some beings. Even the Adena people, the giants of the eastern half of the United States, their royal class elongated their skulls. And they're the ones found in the burial mounds that were giant. And here we have some natives in the Toltec region of Mexico. This is an ancient codex that shows them putting to death a giant. And there were many of these accounts of Mexico as well, over 10-foot tall skeletons. All around the world, once again, isolated Pacific Islands, Nan Madol, we have this incredible structure. And we have this American Geographical Society account about Captain Coffin finding, Coffin, ironically, he visited the vaults and he took from it several bones of gigantic size. Now, he was one of the first ones to encounter the ancient tombs at Nam Madol, this Micronesian island, and he found giant bones. And the native people there don't go to the site. Now, that's not just hocus pocus. My friend Al taught English in Nam Madol in the 50s, and he got a piece of fruit from the ancient ruins. He took it back, and the natives who don't go there say, throw it away, it's cursed. That was the giants and the twin brother giants built this site, and they used levitation. That is the oral tradition there. You can find it on the internet, this fascinating backstory that the giants built this incredible megalithic site on this pinpoint of an island in the middle of the Pacific. And it's like 50-foot tall basalt megalithic structures, like 200 million tons of stone carried from the other side of the island. If I did it, I would hope to have levitation technology. But once again, they're telling the same story. We go down to Patagonia. For hundreds of years, giants were reported by the explorers like Magellan, 7, 8, 9-foot tall giants. They're in maps. They're in fact in this Frederick Cook article. Cook wrote about this in the late 1800s, about the Ona people. And he met them in Patagonia. They were between 6 and 7.5 feet tall, wore animal skins, and they lived simply. And here are some pictures that he has. A 6'6" woman and a 7'6" male. He has many pictures like this. Now, these people represent an anthropological mystery. They are much bigger and much taller than modern day humans. And they were exterminated by the British in the late 1800s, which is another part of this story. A lot of the native people were decimated by war and manifest destiny and diseases. And they held not just the genetic clues, but the oral history clues of a lot of this giant survivor evidence, if you will. Hugh talked about this account of Captain Allen in Sicily, right? So I'm just going to add that James Allen was the captain who found this strange skeleton over 10 foot tall with hieroglyphs from this lost age. And he gave a, and here's the account here, but he also gave us a sworn statement attesting to the truth when he got back in Philadelphia. So he went out of his way to say, I found this giant skeleton, and here's the account of it. And I found the all these different accounts from his attorney and everything like that, where he verifies this find, and hearkening back to this age. So it is worthy of notice that the Cyclops, a race of men of gigantic stature, referred to these ancients, were in the western parts of Sicily. Hugh showed some of these sites already. I'll show a couple more slides. All associated with the giants, the Cyclops, the megalithic building, this interconnected Cyclopean style of stonework is shared all around the planet once again. And when you ask the ancient chroniclers, they say it was a race of giants. So in the Bible, Samuel 21:20, there was a giant from Gath, and he has 6 fingers on every hand and 6 toes on each foot, 24 digits in all. Now, this is a trait associated with giants across the world that I'll show you. The first mention of polydactyl, extra digits, it's Nesuma Ibzu. So 2,800 tetralogical almonds were found at Ashpurnabal in Nineveh. That was about 2,800 BC. The library of Ashpurnabal was from about 1,700 BC. Here are some of the tablets at the British Museum. So they talk about on the tablets, they're very specifically talking about 6 fingers and 6 toes. And this is always associated with the divine, supernatural, or malevolent all around the planet. So right here, you have a votive child's foot with 6 toes. And on the right, you have the Suma Ibzu from 2800 BC. Oh, I'm sorry, 26th century BC. What am I to do for my child with 6 toes? It's like this supernatural trait. This guy has 27 digits in all. There are, like Hugh was saying, people get their double rows of teeth removed when they're younger. Oftentimes, there are many people who are born polydactylous with extra digits, and they have them removed as well. This guy clearly didn't. This is a trait that lives on in humans. Now, oddly enough, the mystic Edgar Cayce associates this trait with Atlantis and Lemuria. Lemuria was the Pacific Atlantis, this other lost world that was destroyed in 50,000 BC. So anyways, he says that Muzuan traveled to the Gobi Desert in 9026 BC, and that he was 6 feet tall, blue-eyed, hair dark gold, hands 6-figured. It's not always associated with giants. Oftentimes it is, but you'll see sometimes it's associated as well as the giants with this lost world. Now, in the Gobi Desert, ironically, recently they found the Tarim Basin mummies between 6 foot tall and 6 foot 6 inches tall, where they have Caucasoid traits, blue eyes, yellow hair, red hair. So these very large mummies that were Caucasoid are found right where Cayce said the Lemurians showed up in ancient times. A lot of what Cayce said was posthumously verified by science and continues to be this day. So Pliny the Elder even talks about this encounter between the Romans and the Chinese, the Ceres of the time, at Taprobane. They exceeded the normal height, they had flaxen hair and blue eyes, and they made an uncouth sort of noise by way of talking. Now, that's not your typical Chinese person. That's a strange interloper, if you will, that has Caucasian traits. Now, the entire globe is littered with 6 fingers and 6 toes. I will show you some of the examples. This is in New Mexico. This is Newspaper Rock in Utah. Here you go. You see on the left, 6 toes, 6 toes. Right here, giant footprint with 6 toes. This guy here has 6 fingers. Look at his feet. This is at McCorkle Ranch in Utah. And it's not just out in the Southwest, too. They're found all over the place. Eastern Oklahoma, petroglyphs. And the giant ones are usually, see the giant one has 6 toes on the left, and the normal size ones are smaller. Sedona, Arizona. On the right, Utah, the 6-toed one is larger considerably. This 7-toed petroglyph. This is at Chaco Canyon, which is interesting. National Geographic article, once again, extra fingers and toes were revered in this ancient culture. So the people of Chaco Canyon, they decorated their great houses with 6-digit footprints and sandal-shaped art. They revered these beings. Right there are 3 20-inch tall, 6-toed petroglyphs on the wall. And to the far left corner, there is a small 5-toed normal size footprint. So initially intrigued by the divine powers attributed to the polydactyls among the Maya, research is led by anthropologist Patricia Crown of the University of New Mexico, conducted a comprehensive review of the evidence for the condition at the canyon's sacred Pueblo site. So she is like, and she found this 6-toed cast actually and made it. She's intrigued that once again, polydactylism is associated with giants and the supernatural and the divine. Texas, Lewis, Texas, right here. This is interesting, right? This is from the National Park Service website in Texas. A large foot, often with 6 toes, is a common symbol depicted in petroglyphs and pictographs. What do you think this foot could mean? You know what it means. Illinois, the normal size foot at the bottom, and then the giant foot with 6 toes. This is from Morse's Geology, 1938. In Baja, New Mexico, there is an ancient belief that there was a war between the 6-toed and the 5-toed people, and the 6-fingered and 5-toed people. And here at Baja, you have an incredible display of rock art at the Coso district. You should go there if anybody's there sometime. So the strange Joker-like person on the right has 6 fingers. On the right, 6 toes at war with a normal size being. Right here, he has 6 fingers, excuse me. He's littered with arrows. Right here, this guy has 6 fingers, and is filled with arrows, just like this ancient war that was talked about. We have this, representation of a war that went on with polydactylous people and normal sized people. And you go to China and you find the Buddha in a cave with 6 fingers. It's associated with the divine and the supernatural once again. 1938, Nazi scientists are out in Tibet looking for God knows what, mystical artifacts. They find an axatite meteoritic iron statue with 6 fingers. And this is the Buddha, I believe, or a Buddha-like figure. Ain Ghazal, one of the oldest settlements on the planet from 8200 BC. It starts in phase 1 at 10,300 years ago. 8300 BC, and it ends 9950. So what I'm displaying here and showing here is some of the oldest statues in the world display polydactylism, extra digits, and androgyny. These created gods with different traits are basically displayed in the oldest statues on the planet. The Ain Ghazal statues right here, you'll see in a second. So there are 2-headed Ain Ghazal statues. And Eretz Ziffer, the archaeologist, writes this paper about the first Adam, androgyny, in the Ain Ghazal 2-headed bust in context. So he shows the 6-toed footprints or statue feet of Ain Ghazal, and he talks about the 2-headed statue, and it is proposed that the Ain Ghazal statues represented deities. The polydactylism is a rare genetic syndrome of the statues. It's viewed as a divine attribute, based on the cuneiform tablet, identifies the 2-headed busts and the likes of the gods Marduk and Ishtar. These ancient gods, even Viracocha, are shown to have 6 fingers and toes, to be androgynous, sexless beings, and to create humans with earth on potter's wheels or through genetic experiments. So the point I'm making here is, not only is in the mystical accounts of all these peoples, it is in the actual statues, the oldest statues on the planet display androgyny and polydactylism. And Richard Barnett wrote about the polydactylism of the Ain Ghazal statues as a mark of the supernatural entities, the race of Rephaim, or giants. Now here at Jericho, also extremely ancient, pre-pottery Neolithic B site, 10,700 years ago. The statue there has polydactylism once again. So you have this here's some of the Tower of Jericho and other specifics about the site. But the point I'm making is it's just astonishing that the oldest statues in the world, you find this. Polydactylism, the association with giants. Tel Damaya is in Jordan. Now, it's an Iron Age site that's on an Air Force base. And look at the hands on these anthropomorphic forms. They have 6 fingers right there. 6 fingers are the rule in a village in Spain. Also in Ecuador, the Rawani people and the Pueblo people have higher incidence of polydactylism, like survivors showed up on their shores and interbred with the general population. Just like in Ulster, Ireland, the highest incidence of pituitary gigantism, 1 in 150 on the planet, is found in Ulster County, as if the Tuatha De Danann and these ancient giants from Atlantis interbred with their population. Now, it sounds like a science fiction movie, but there is evidence once again for it. The Basque people believe they are descended from Atlantis, and they have the highest percentage of Rh negative on the planet, almost 50%. Now, the Iroquois people in the Midwest believe they came from a sunken continent, and they have haplogroup X2 up to a 25% percentage, one of the highest in the world. The point I'm making, there are these genetic markers that line up with maybe it was this lost world in the Middle Atlantic, and these giants and these advanced beings had different genetics, like haplogroup X2 or polydactylism or Rh negative, that were passed on these general populations, because the dispersion of traits and genetic attributes around the world does not match up with out of Africa and other mainstream theories. It lines up with survivors from a lost world that had supernatural abilities and that were genetic masters of creation. That, just like Sitchin in the Anunnaki Chronicles would agree with, and I tend to agree with it too. So here you have the Canary Islands in the middle of the Atlantic as well, another site with tons of giant lore. You have this account of a 15-foot skeleton from 1855, and the skull had 80 teeth in it, like the double rows of teeth account we find in ancient America. You know, I'm showing you an example here. Here's 2 rows of teeth, just like the 80 teeth. So Alice Cook, in her academic paper, writes, the chaplains of Bethencourt found in Fuerteventura men of extraordinary stature. They were by some supposed to be a race of giants. Among the dead, after a certain battle the Spaniards found a warrior 9 feet in height. So you have the early Spanish explorers showing up in the Canary Islands that were supposed to be connected to the ancient Atlantis, and they found people who were basically afraid of the ocean. They did not go on the seas. They did not build boats. They were incredibly tall and strong, and had these ancient traditions of a lost world, and they were of giant sized, and they mummified the dead, just like the Egyptians and the Mayans and other peoples. And there's in fact pyramids on Canary Islands as well that Thor Heyerdahl investigated. In fact, he ended up living there at the end of his life. Now, Heyerdahl built the Kon-Tiki and took it across the Atlantic, or the Pacific, I'm sorry. So 6 fingers and 6 toes shows up everywhere around the planet. This is the place of ghosts in an isolated Micronesian island called Kiribati. See the giant rock art with 6 feet, or a footprint of a giant. Now, this anthropologist Turabot shows up in 1949, and he hears from the elders that these, sorry for the lousy picture, but that these giant 6-toed footprints are from the giants. The book describes in detail the evidence for prehistoric giants and the record of the gigantic footprints. At one point, author Turabot writes, here various footprints can clearly be seen in the volcanic stone. Some of them are so huge as to seem impossible. Most have 6 toes on each foot. Isolated Pacific island, you know, there's talk of giants, legends of giants, but the specific notation of giants with polydactylous hands and feet is astonishing to me. And there's one of the elders in the footprint. Easter Island, same thing. Polydactylous footprints. Fiji. Australia, these giant androgynous spirit beings, spirit guardians they're called. Look, 6 fingers, 6 toes. Utterly astonishing. This guy, see his hands? They're going out of their way to display this supernatural trait all around the planet. This is no mistake. These beings as well, 6 fingers. And in fact, in the late 1800s, I found this document of parchment where these natives came from an isolated island. I think they were being relocated, and they were asked to draw and explain some of their oral histories. And this is what you got from one of the elders, was this strange being with, doesn't even have a head, this like supernatural being. And look, he has 6 fingers and 6 toes, all around 24 digits, just like the Bible talks about. Another astonishing connection. Now, here's Teotihuacan. In Mesoamerica, human representations with 6-digit hands and feet are identical in lithic sculptures from Palenque, Zapotec, Teotihuacan. Here you go again. All these deities have 6 fingers, and they're all these divine gods and creator gods, and they're often androgynous. And there's the Palenque ruins right there. There I am right there. Here you go. All over the ruins, 6 fingers, 6 toes. Paracas, look at the fingers, 6, 6. The Aztec site in the middle of Mexico City at the Temple of Mayor. This is where Tenochtitlan once was before it was destroyed by the Spanish. Right here, you have this deity, 2 deities that both have 6 toes. Look at the 6 toes, either side on the mural there as the entrance. Aztec 6 toes. I'm 6 fingers. So many, I'm getting confused. And I apologize. Most of these are from academic journals, and I don't want to inundate you with this. I have several videos at Hugh's Megalithic site. I have a full hour on polydactylism. I have a full hour on androgyny and hybrids in Atlantis, and you could sit and watch all this information. I just want to give this large overview to make my case. You know, I don't have an agenda here. I'm not trying to bang you over the head with evidence. I'm trying to say, as an objective, curious investigator, this is so well beyond coincidence. It makes my head want to explode. But it's mocked like I'm somehow out of my mind. You know, that's what the derision that I have to deal with is kind of annoying because I am not an unstable person. I lead what you would call a successful life. You know, I take care of Linus the cat. I'm a stonemason. I'm a coach. I was a decathlete at one point. I have an academic background. I am not an unhinged lunatic. I just, looking objectively at this evidence, it just blows me away. And I like to share it. I think people pick up and like, you know, holy shit, the amount of, I never knew Easter Island and Hawaii and all these places had these polydactylous imprints everywhere. So anyways, prehistoric polydactylism, biological evidence in rock art. This just came out in the International Journal of Paleopathology in 2018. They found everywhere around Argentina and Chile ancient sites depicting, once again, polydactylism, this divine attribute associated with the giants and a lost world. And they were stunned, the researchers. They believed, moreover, the broad dispersion of hands and feet in rock art images with polydactyl in Chile and Argentina could suggest that it was more frequent than currently documented in the bioarchaeological record. Now, I don't think it's more frequent. I don't think people had more polydactylism than they thought. I think what it is that it is such a revered trait or feared trait and associated with giants and androgynous creator gods like Viracocha and everybody else, that it is displayed everywhere in such profusion. And here's Viracocha. He's a hybrid being on the right. He has 6 toes. This guy needs a pair of underwear on, but he's a god from the Etruscan world, and he is noted in academic journal to have 6 fingers and toes. Right here, Marlik, Iran, 1900 BC. These beings, 6 toes. Here you go again. The ancient world is littered with it. In fact, one of the oldest idols from 3500 BC found in Cyprus was this mother goddess with 6 toes that was well-worn limestone. Women would pray to her when they were when they were in childbirth, which begs the question, who is this divine queen from the past that is getting prayed to in 3500 BC that has 6 toes? Fertility goddess right there. I'm sorry, it's 3500 BC. That date's a little wrong. You go all the way over the other side of the world, the rock art shelter. Look on the right. I'm sorry, on the left, 6 fingers in Thailand. At Tulum, the Temple of Frescoes, Hugh and I went here, 7 on the left, 7 fingers. And interestingly enough, the great warrior Kukulkan, who shows up with the Tuatha De Danann after the flood, that Hugh and I are writing about in our book now, in the British Isles, they have supernatural abilities. They are giant oftentimes. They have incredible weapons and crafts. He is known specifically, this great hero, to have each foot and had 7 toes and each hand 7 fingers, the nails with the grip of a hawk's claw. You can find this on Wikipedia. So he was called the foam of the sea, just like Viracocha. They showed up in this ancient craft of silver and rotating turbines. You go to Botswana. Mat Singh was the giant who shows up after the flood and is the hero of these people in Botswana. 6 toes right here. And you have Credo Mutwa, who is the elder and the wisdom keeper of the Zuni people. And he talks about the footprints of Lana Lagao Kwalbi, said to belong to an enormous man like the giant Mat Singh lived thousands of years ago. He was a 6-toed individual with massive feet. The footprint on one of his large feet was imprinted on a rock just outside Cadia. So the entire planet is littered with lore of how the giants were the ancient ones who showed up after the flood or lived before the flood. On the right, you see 6 fingers, and yeah, that, I'm sorry, it ends right there. The madness ends there. And I'm sorry, I don't want to inundate you with information. You can see my desire to get it all out there. But my point is that polydactylism is associated with these divine and sometimes malevolent giants. Like, why do we have these accounts of the giant wisdom keepers and the malevolent giants? Because that is the association made back to Atlantis, where Madame Blavatsky talks about ancient sorcery and the black arts, and that the Fomorians showed up in Ireland after the flood and they were malevolent. But there was the Tuatha De Danann, who were the sons and daughters of light and the keepers of light, who were the teachers of the ancient geometry that Hugh talked about. The giants are linked to Atlantis, and they are linked to this ancient geometric knowledge and stone building knowledge that we find all around the world. So hopefully we displayed a coherent picture of the past, oftentimes through the eyes of mystics that talk about that there was a lost homeland. Hancock, Robert Schoch, Greg Little, I think a lot of others would say they believe that there's a lost civilization somewhere. I call it Atlantis, Plato called it Atlantis. You could call it Hyperborea or some other world, but it seemed to have been destroyed. We know through science 12,800 years ago. And the survivors went out and they repromulgated society. They started, once again, society in Sumeria and China and all around the world in Peru. And they shared the arts of geometry and mathematics, the megalithic building techniques, the ancient geomancy and geometry that Hugh talked about. They were sometimes portrayed as wisdom keepers and native chiefs, but sometimes they were ancient giants who were cannibalistic, like the Bible talks about, or the red-haired giants of Nevada. So you have this dualistic story that goes on. But to me, it's just fascinating that all of these sources tell the story, but the entire world is littered with evidence of it, not only historical accounts, but polydactylous and androgynous statues and rock art the world over that could not be communicated in an era of inefficient communication. So that is, being an independent, open-minded, hopefully, and curious researcher, it is so beyond coincidence, I can't tell you, and that is why I find this utterly fascinating. So I'll say that, thank you for enduring my onslaught, but I really appreciate that you have an interest in this, and I hope that was instructive. Hugh? Let's see here.
Okay, well, I think we're kind of finished now. So if people got any questions, they can put them in the chat on the right-hand side. If not, we'll wish you a farewell. if we don't get a question in 5 seconds, that's it.
Well, I'll also say I'm on Facebook, and you can message me a question, and I'll try to answer it at length. And Hugh and I both have lots of videos that cover this content as well. So I'm always happy to interact and answer the curiosities of people.
All right. Okay. All right. Well, I guess we'll say goodbye to everyone. Thanks for listening, people. Appreciate it. And we'll see you next time.
Thank you, everyone. And I appreciate the having an interest in these topics, and hopefully follow us and check out our videos, come on a tour. And, we feel like a lot of people are going in the direction we're going in, exploring these mysteries, and people want to feel part of it. And it doesn't require a special skill set, just an open mind. And I wish everybody well.
Oh, someone has asked a question here, actually. Would you mind listing some of the books you were referring to? I think it might be for you, Jim.
Yep.
I mean, the ones I was referring to was Sowers of Thunder by Anthony Roberts, and American Genesis by Jeffrey Goodman, and of course Giants on Record by Hugh Newman and Jim Vieira. But yeah, you can check that out. I hope that answers your question there, Ty. And you can catch me on megalithomania.co.uk, or again, we're on Facebook and stuff, so people can send us messages there. And I just want to thank you for listening. Thanks to Neil for setting it up, and we hope you got something out of that. So we'll take care, everybody. We'll see you later.